All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. In this session, we're going to be looking at John chapter 18, verses 1 through 27. And remember, it's Passover night. And Jesus has, in fact, celebrated the Passover with his disciples, and John has recorded a lot of what Jesus had said that night to them. It's really his final words, preparing them for what lies ahead. And in the last chapter, John also recorded a prayer that Jesus had prayed about his ministry and his mission, and prayed for them as his apostles, and ultimately prayed for all of those who would believe in Jesus through their teaching. Well, now in chapter 18, the action shifts to Jesus' arrest and his trial and his execution. And as an eyewitness to these events, John tells it all with gripping details. So let's look at how Jesus was arrested that night of Passover. John chapter 18, verse 1 reads like this: When Jesus had spoken these words, the prayer that he had just finished in chapter 17, when John had spoken these words, he went away with his disciples across the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden which he entered with his disciples. And so he goes out the eastern side of Jerusalem, down the slope, across the Kidron Valley. That's the ravine of the Kidron mentioned here. It's a little valley out the east side of Jerusalem between the city and the Mount of Olives. And so he goes down and then across that valley and then up the other side, partway up the hill that is the Mount of Olives, to a place where there's a garden. And though the garden is not named in John's gospel, we know from the other gospels it's the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's an olive grove. That's where Jesus goes with his disciples. And look what John tells us. Now, Judas, who was betraying him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met with his disciples there. In other words, this was a very common place for Jesus to gather. Judas knew that it was a place where Jesus met. And so Jesus could have gone somewhere else. He could have gone to a new location that Judas didn't know about. He could have hidden. But remember, this whole night started with John telling us that Jesus knew that his hour had come. He knew it was time. And he's not fleeing, and he's not hiding. So Judas knows the place, and therefore, verse 3, Judas, having obtained a Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. So picture not a full Roman cohort. That would be about 1,000 soldiers, and that's probably not what John intends to communicate, but a detachment from the cohort that's currently stationed in Jerusalem. And typically at feast time, like Passover, the Romans would bring in extra soldiers as crowd control and all that because of all the extra people that would flock to Jerusalem. So there's more Roman soldiers available in Jerusalem, and those Roman soldiers are there specifically to put down any threat of revolt or rioting or anything like that. And so now a detachment from those Roman soldiers come out of the city to this garden on the hillside, along with some officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. That is members of the Jewish temple police force, because they had their own security force for the temple. So some of them come along as well. And they arrive with lanterns and torches and weapons. Hold that detail in mind, because that's important as well. Look at verse 4 then. Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, came out into the open and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" Now, the other Gospels tell us that Jesus had left 9 of his apostles in one place in the garden, and he takes 3 others with him deeper into the garden and goes to a place away from all of them, and he is agonizing in prayer before this crowd of people arresting him would have arrived. He knows what's coming. He knows that it's all about ready to happen, and he's preparing for it by praying. In fact, the synoptics tell us that he's agonizing in prayer. Luke tells us so much agony that his sweat is mixing with blood as the strain and stress upon him causes some of his capillaries in his scalp to burst. And so he's agonizing deeply in prayer, knowing that this is coming. And remember, they're coming with lanterns, torches, and weapons. They come out of the city, down a hill, across the same valley, up the hillside, in the dark of night, carrying torches and lanterns. In other words, Jesus can see them coming. And I picture them coming into the garden, finding the 9 who have been left in one place, but not finding Jesus. And now there's some commotion, and so Jesus, from wherever he's at in the garden, comes out of the dark to where they're at from where he was praying, and he goes out to meet them. And think about that. He's in the dark, in the garden, by himself. He could have ran. So initially, he could have gone to a different location that Judas didn't know about. Now in the garden, when they arrive, he's not immediately visible and present. He could have ran. He could have gone up over the top of the Mount of Olives, out into the eastern desert where David himself had fled 1,000 years prior. He could have done all of that, but he didn't. Why? Because he knows his hour has come, and he's been in the garden praying to his Father, preparing for it. So he goes out to meet them and asks them, "Who are you looking for?" And they answered him in verse 5, "Jesus the Nazarene." And he said to them, "I am he." And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing there with them. Now, we've seen all throughout John's gospel the I am statements of Jesus. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. We've even seen the very unqualified statement when Jesus said, "Before Abraham was born, I am." And here, in this moment, in the dim light of their torches and lanterns in the dark of the garden, Jesus says something similar. He literally said, not I am he, just I am. And it seems to have been spoken with such force that it started those coming to arrest him. Look at verse 6. Now then, when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. And so Jesus steps out, asks who they're looking for. They say Jesus. He says, I am. And they kind of stumble backwards, trip over each other, and fall to the ground. And I think John probably sees a little bit of theological irony in this moment. Why? Because in all of the theophanies, those places where God appears in visible form in the Old Testament, people were so awestruck that they often fell to the ground. And here, Jesus, referring to himself, speaks the divine name, I am, and does so in such force that the men fall down. And so my suspicion is that John, with a little bit of a wry twinkle in his eye, writes these words because he sees a little bit of theological irony. It's like a theophany here in the garden. Though they don't recognize it and they don't see it, Jesus simply says, I am, and the men fall down. So he asked them again, verse 7, whom are you seeking? And they said, Jesus, the Nazarene. And Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. So if you're seeking me, let these men go on their way. And so that's why I kind of picture them finding the 9, maybe, grabbing a hold of some of these guys. And now Jesus is like, look, I'm the one you want. Let these men go. And John explains this took place so that the word which he spoke would be fulfilled. Of those you have given me, I lost not one. That is something Jesus prayed in his prayer, where he said, of the men you have given me, I haven't lost any of them except the son of destruction. And so Jesus wants these guys to be protected. Let them go on their own way. Take me. Well, Peter isn't going to go down without a fight, at least not right now in this moment. So look at verse 10. Then Simon Peter, since he had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. And the slave's name was Malchus. And so Peter swings his sword, lops off a part of this guy's ear. Luke actually tells us that Jesus heals this man's ear before they let him away under arrest. And so Jesus said to Peter in verse 11, put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, am I not to drink it? Recall that in the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is praying in the garden, take this cup from me. This is how he's picturing this moment. This is the cup the Father has given him to drink. And Jesus is now resolved to drink it. So Peter, put your sword away. We're not going to do that. We're not going to fight. I don't need you to defend me. This is why I've come. And so verse 12, the Roman cohort, the commander who was leading that cohort, and the officers from the Jews, the Jewish security force, they arrested Jesus and bound him, tied his hands together, maybe even tied it together with a lead rope. They bound him, and they brought him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. John is the only gospel to mention that Jesus was first brought to Annas. And Annas had been the high priest for a good period of time, but was deposed by the governor who preceded Pilate. And over the course of time, actually, 5 of Annas' sons were appointed as high priest. And at this particular time, Caiaphas, Annas' son-in-law, was the actual high priest. But Annas, as the patriarch of the high priestly family, still held considerable influence. And so Jesus is brought to him. And John explains in verse 14, now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was in their best interest for one man to die on behalf of the people. That's recorded in John chapter 11, verse 49. And so John recalls that for us. And so here we have Jesus arrested, brought initially before Annas, and that's where his so-called trial begins. Now at that moment, John cuts back to Peter. When we last saw him in the garden, he was being reprimanded by Jesus for cutting off a man's ear. So we cut back to him, and here's what's going on with Peter in verse 15. Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Based on what is said in what follows, that other disciple is most likely John himself. So he says, now that disciple was known to the high priest, and he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter was standing at the door outside. And so if we're correct in identifying this disciple as John himself, John's family had some connections in Jerusalem and had some powerful connections. He was known somehow to the high priest, and that sort of gave him a little bit of access. And he used that access to enter into the courtyard, but Peter was left outside, wasn't allowed to enter. So notice what happens, verse 16. That other disciple who was known to the high priest went out, spoke to the doorkeeper, and brought Peter in. So he used his connections to bring Peter into the courtyard of Annas' residence where Jesus is currently being held and tried. Well, as Peter comes into the courtyard, look what happens in that moment, verse 17. Then the slave woman who was the doorkeeper. So picture John talking to the doorkeeper, getting access to his friend. The doorkeeper opens the gate into the courtyard. And as Peter comes in, she looks at him and she recognizes him. And so the slave woman who is the doorkeeper said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And Peter said, "I am not." And there we get denial number 1. Not long ago, in the garden, Peter was full of bravado, and he swung his sword. But now, here he is, denying that he even knows Jesus to a servant girl at the door. And if John is standing right there with him when he says this, I can imagine John looking over him a little bit shocked, like, wait, what, Peter? Well, Peter goes into the courtyard, and verse 18, now the slaves and the officers were standing there in the courtyard, and having made a charcoal fire because it was cold, they were warming themselves. So Peter joins them, and Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. And so Peter is there in the courtyard, standing around a fire pit of some sort, warming himself. John then cuts back to Jesus and his trial. And so verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple area where all the Jews congregate. And I said nothing in secret." So Jesus, in other words, is saying, look, my teachings, if you're wondering about those things, they're public record. I spoke in public. There are plenty of people who could tell you what I taught. I didn't do it behind closed doors. Spoke in public areas. Why are you asking me? Ask those who have heard what I spoke to them. Look, these people know what I said. Now, this isn't just a snarky reply from Jesus. What Jesus is actually doing here is he's asking for a proper trial. Where are the witnesses? If you're going to have a trial, don't ask me. Bring in the witnesses. They know what I taught. They know what I said. And so what Jesus is doing is really recognizing that we're already in violation of trial procedure because it's nighttime and it's dark. We don't have any witnesses. And he's really trying to press on that point, asking for a proper trial with witnesses. But when he said this, verse 22, one of the officers who was standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, "Is that the way you answer the high priest?" And the word for strike is typically a word that refers to like a hard slap. We might say smacked. This person smacked Jesus and said, "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" Jesus replied in verse 23, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? Why do you smack me?" Again, striking a prisoner was contrary to Jewish law. So again, Jesus is reminding them of proper procedure, and he's denying that he has spoken wrongly. He's saying, produce the evidence. Let's follow procedure. Let's not just make this some rogue trial. Produce the evidence. Produce the witnesses. Well, that's all John records of this little moment before Annas. And so look at verse 24. So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Caiaphas is the official high priest, and Annas is sort of like high priest emeritus. And if Jesus' case is going to be successfully prosecuted before the Roman governor Pilate, they're going to need official charges. And Annas hasn't really gotten very far. And Caiaphas is the current reigning high priest. And so off to Caiaphas Jesus goes. Now, most likely, Caiaphas is not very far away. It's possible he's actually somewhere in the same high priestly household or complex near where Annas is already at and where Jesus is standing before him. Could be that he's maybe in the temple and he's sent out servants to round up some members of the Sanhedrin. We know from the other Gospels that members of the Sanhedrin are there that night for this trial, which, by the way, again, holding a trial after dark is contrary to Jewish law. So we're just violating procedure in so many ways here. So Annas has taken his stab at trying to figure out some charges against Jesus. He hasn't gotten very far, and he sends Jesus off to Caiaphas. Well, then John cuts back to Peter again. So verse 25, now Peter was still standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You are not one of his disciples as well, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." And so here we have denial number 2 there around the fire with some of the servants and officers who are standing in the courtyard. Then, verse 26, one of the slaves of the high priest, one of the high priest's servants again, who was actually related to the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" But Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. And there we get denial number 3. Now, we will, in our next recording, continue to follow along with Jesus' trial, but we're going to cut it off here at this point for the sake of time. And I just want to reflect on the contrast between Jesus and Peter. John has intentionally woven Peter's denials together with Jesus' initial interrogation before Annas. And Jesus, as you watch this, he's calm, composed, and fearless. He calls on Annas to follow procedure. He denies any wrongdoing and challenges them to produce the evidence. Jesus isn't rattled and he's not shaken at all. But Peter? Well, Peter, over the course of this initial bit of the night, he had asserted that he would die with Jesus earlier that evening. He denies Jesus 3 times. Or if you think back to the garden, in the garden, Jesus didn't hide. Jesus didn't run. He stepped out of the dark to meet these men. And Jesus revealed who he really is. I am. And Peter, there in the garden, well, he was going to fight. He got out his sword. But Jesus must drink his cup. What you see of Jesus in this whole little initial part of his arrest and trial is Jesus is fully in charge of himself. And he's fully in charge of this moment. It's time. And Jesus walks right into this moment. Peter he's full of emotion, and his emotions get the best of him in the garden. Then he's full of fear, and so he denies Jesus in the courtyard. Jesus, he knows exactly why he's come. This is the hour for which he was sent into the world, and he's fully in charge of himself and this moment. It's really a powerful contrast that John has presented for us and how he has woven together this story of Jesus with the actions of Peter. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page at World Family Mission where you can put in a dollar amount. Click a little box that says Make This Monthly if you want it to be a monthly donation to support this ministry. And all monthly donors get access to the Study Hub. Or if you want to, you can just sign up straight for the Study Hub right on the homepage as another way to support this ministry. So thanks a ton for your support.